We've arrived at myth 8, and let us consider just for a moment, in terms of our navigation, where we are. This education is beautiful because it allows us to have a compass not for any particular realm, but a compass for exploring all realms, no matter what they are, no matter how many dimensions, no matter whether time flows forward or backwards, or symmetrically, even surrealistic, even imaginary realms. In other words, this realm is like 21st century mathematics. It's capable to function in any universe whatsoever and to make transitions between them if necessary. All this is to say, as we're navigating, we need to have some way to generate a coordination of place and focus. The ancient formula, which appears classically in Cicero, was loci et foci, locus and focus. The locus is the place, and the focus is where in the place am I. And out of loci et foci came the classical art of memory. In a pedestrian way, the classic art of memory was misunderstood by those kinds of persons who were clumsy, that is to say, limited only to an integral process, and they mistook loci et foci for the art of memory, where actually a more sophisticated, developed human being who not only has an integral cycle at their command, but as well has a differential cycle at their command. Loci et foci is the basis, the foundation for a transformation, and the transformation of loci et foci is the art of memory. Because loci et foci, place and focus, has nothing to do with memory at all. It has to do with imagination. And the function of imagination is in a paired relationship to the function of memory. So it takes an education like this, a comprehensive education like this, to bring both the integral and the differential, both the power of imagination and the power of memory into a paired focus. One example, when facing a historical challenge, if you meet it on the basis of imagination, you will always fail. Always. You will fail because the cards are always dealt that way. Failure is in those cards. Because imagination is a function of integration and performs admirably when the energy is integral. But when the energy shifts current and goes into differentiality, imagination is no damn good. You can't trust it. Imagination in a differential mode becomes surreality. It becomes absurdity. And one of the great outstanding lessons of the 20th century, which will stand for all time, for the next 20 millennia, is the object lesson of carrying the expectations of imagination into differential fields and failing abysmally. You end up either with the surreality, as pointed out, say, like Max Ernst or Salvador Dali, or you end up with absurdity, as pointed out by Samuel Beckett or Giacometti. A Giacometti sculpture of a cinder burnt out figure is someone who was frazzed to the bone by the frustration of trying to apply the beauties of their imagination to the differential inhospitality to imagination, which something like history would have, or something like vision. And one of the reasons in ancient times vision was called magic is because magic is supernatural. Consciousness is supranatural in that it's differential and not integral. So you need an education that not only matures the capability of imagination, but later on, quite distinctly, matures the capabilities of memory. The art of memory is an indelible part of the maturation of consciousness. Whereas in the natural cycle, memory would be a premature, self-defeating capacity, which is why it doesn't develop. Nature does not encourage memory whatsoever, and it's a misnomer to talk about cellular memory. It's a misnomer to talk about the body remembering. Or it is junk metaphysics to say the body remembers past lives. All this is due to naivete on a massive scale. Nature, in its encoding, does not use a mnemonic differential indexing whatsoever, but posits an integral, and it's the integral that works in nature all the time. One of the great principles of the energy of nature on cosmic scales that gravity works. Gravity is an integral, an integrating energy. Electromagnetism is an integrating energy. The strong and the weak forces in the atom are integral energies. They integrate. And so stuff holds together, tends to clump, tends to want to come together. But that clumping, that coming together, produces in human beings, in a matured fashion, what the Romans called gravitas, the gravity and dignity of the individual. But that Roman gravitas is helpless when taken out of the ethos in which it was developed, and needs for its support not only the ethos within which it was developed, its tribal cultural basis, its language format, its habitual ritual comportment, its mythological structure, and even its symbolic matrix. But if you put a Roman citizen outside of the planet Earth, if you put him on the moon, he's totally helpless. If you put him in some other star system, you'd think he's crazy. And indeed, most people who don't understand the space program today are very good citizens of Rome. They're classic Romans. They don't get it. They see space populated by aliens, by predators, by monsters. They're fearful. Because the differential cosmos doesn't integrate, it differentiates. It has a whole different process of relating. And so you need an education that pays attention to all of this. Otherwise, it's, worthless. It's not worthless if you're going to stay in Rome and be a Roman. But the headline news is that there are no more Romes. Those forms do not work anymore, and they will never work again. Because forms like that, integral forms, always are subject to a time deadline. They have a lifetime. Anything that can be integrated comes to an end. Anything that can be put together has a finality. Or, to put it in the words of the Buddha, all composite things are illusion because they're temporary. And though the temporarity may seem very large in terms of human life, nevertheless, they are realistically temporary and they will come to an end. One of the classic ways of speaking of it was that natural forms are time-bound. They always come to a point of death. And so the natural solution to death is recycling, rebirthing, coming back into life again. Spring. Spring is the integral answer to the time-bound problem of form. And really good Romans understand this, and so they yearn for rebirth. Whereas someone in differential consciousness looks upon a rebirthing process as rather limited. It's useful and necessary in a natural ecology, and as long as one is limiting oneself to a natural ecology, this is well and good. But as soon as you open up to reality, to the differential cosmos, those limitations are crippling. And so to become addicted to those kinds of expectations limit you to your options of operation. We live on the cusp of a whole new series of time forms that have not yet matured. They haven't even begun or have just barely begun to come in. One of the maturations of the immediate future is addressed by this education, and that is a complete realistic way of living, rather than some kind of ethos-based, integral, limited existence. Now, we've seen that the coordinates of our education are largely recognizable in terms of a very large pair of cycles, two cycles. One of them an integral cycle that brings things together, one a differential cycle that allows them to be distinct and increasingly distinct. Both processes, the process of integration and the process of differentiation, can be linked together. But the linking together must be in terms of a transformational grammar. One has to be able to speak the language of integration with a transformational grammar in place so that when the time comes, you can shift from talking about how things come together to talking about how things differentiate. And even the language that I'm using now betrays a certain mythic blockiness, because while in integration there are things, in differentiation there are no things. Differential forms are not things. Differential forms are like fields, like an energy field, like an educational field of inquiry, like resonances. So that when you look at electromagnetic energy in the form of a particle of light, a photon, whether that photon is a particle or a wave depends on whether it's being considered in the integral field or in the differential field. In the integral ecology of nature, light is always a particle. It's always a photon as a particle of light. But reality has a built-in transformational grammar so that every photon can also function in a differential cosmos as a wave. This ambidextrous quality of reality is the familiar turf of quantum mechanics in terms of physics and astrophysics. And one of the very first things when you open any popular exposition of quantum mechanics for the layman, physics for the taxicab driver, is they tell you, sentence 1.1, you can't use imagination in a quantum mechanical consideration because imaginative modeling of forms does not operate on that scale in that language for those purposes. And so one has to disengage from the whole function of imagination. And as we have seen in the previous section on ritual, one of the most difficult functions to disengage from is that life function that you have depended upon for your actuality. And to try to disengage from a function which has been essential to you always is a death, a small death, sometimes very large death, a seeming death. And as we saw in ritual in the previous section, that the integral objectivity of action is that things are. That existence happens in manifest forms. There are the things. Are they not solid? Is this not the basis upon which we are real? Is this body not, if it's not me, at least it's the foundation of me, right? Partially. The body is the ritual thing upon which language is founded, upon which mythology is based. But the process of language, while it's in the integral cycle, while it's a part of nature, has a capacity to turn around within itself and begin to have a different referential. Language initially talks in terms of the things, the ritual things, the external world. Words represent things. Book, the word book represents this thing, hand. But words are not referentially limited to a natural representation. They are able to engender larger resonances so that words in their representation, whereas a word stands for a thing, after a while, during usage, during familiarity, the word begins to represent not the thing, but the image of the thing. The image is like the resonance of the thing. So it's not just this book, but any book. So it's the image of a book. The image of a book is different from any particular book. Now the word is still representational, but it's representational of an image. And images sort themselves. How do they sort themselves? They sort themselves on the basis of a ritual categorization. On the basis of what you do with them. What do you do with the things? And on the basis of what you do with the things, language, in its mythic image representational function, distributes itself. It's just like in times when I was a boy, boys that grew up as late as the Second World War in high school were taught to set type. And so you had this large box, wooden box with wooden compartments, and you had lead letters mounded in all these different boxes. And you learn to set type, just like Benjamin Franklin. And you learned that in setting type, that some letters like E are more used than other letters like Q, and so the box for the E's is larger. But in a type font, one of the most indispensable things is a compartment, a wooden compartment that has spacers. There are no letters on those bits, but they are blank. And without spacers, without intervals, you can't separate the letters from one word so that words stand out. Between each word, you have to have a space. And larger spaces for various other kinds of blocking out, the ends of sentences, the ends of paragraphs. And so in setting type, one still had this primordial function, this incredibly primordial function of the way in which language changes from natural representation to symbolic presentation. Because beyond the things of nature are the images, but beyond the images, deeper are the ideas. And a word which has matured from thing to image is on its way to maturing even further to becoming an idea. Now the word book as an idea is extremely different from the word book as this thing. Loud and dirty, because you should never forget it. It is goddamned ignorance not to know the ABCs of reality in a dangerous world. Because there's a spectrum. Because language has this entire spectrum: thing, image, idea. And on the way between image and idea, there is a transformation in language, where instead of its referentiality going externally, its referentiality goes internally. Instead of going through the objectivity of external action and things like the body, the referentiality goes inward to meaning, to the symbolic objectivity of an idea. So that the whole flow of the process of language is a precursor to what's going to happen in consciousness. The process of language is a sketch towards the process of consciousness. The way language works is the way in which eventually consciousness will work. And the first process of consciousness is vision. What used to be called magic. What is psychologically called consciousness. Consciousness is a process, just like language is a process, just like nature is a process. But the process of nature is a distinct, different kind of process from the process of language, and both those processes are distinct from the process of consciousness. So like an old-fashioned typesetter, you have to have a spacing in between. And the spacing in between nature and language is ritual. And the spacing in between language and consciousness is symbol. But what's interesting is that when you have an education which is large enough to be real, which is relentlessly honest enough to be, let's use the term legitimate, then you need to have a spacing, not between processes, but also a spacing in between the objective levels. And just like the body is objective in ritual, the mind is objective in symbols. And later on, we'll see that the person is objective in something that we still call art. That the person is quite extraordinarily different. That the person never occurs in nature, always as supernatural, always as differential. The person is a differential form of objectivity, the very first one. So that the person is as different in the objectivity of art as the objectivity of ritual is embodied in the mask. And so the classical Greeks called a mask a persona, but not a person. And to confuse the persona with the person, to confuse the mask from the spirit, is very, very deep trouble. And the confusion can only happen on the level of scrambled symbolism. It means that somebody's mind is not very clear. It means that the objective mentality of the symbolic objectivity is not well formed at all. So if you're a doctor of civilization, you look at someone who cannot tell that they're playing a role, cannot tell that they're wearing a mask, and you diagnose them as having very weak ideas, very weak symbolic capacity. So what's the regimen of therapy? They have to heal their mind. But you can't go in and just put powerful ideas in someone's mind from outside. This invites a very, very severe reaction. It's called Nazism in some realms, or Marxist-Leninism in some realms. The tyranny of isms, which we've had enough of in our lifetimes, come from this kind of inculcation of symbolic objectivity, which on paper may look fantastic. In Friedrich Nietzsche, the Superman is fantastic persona, is fantastic idea even. In operation makes the standard businessman a party hack, National Socialist hack. The Marxist-Leninism makes the fisherman on the Volga into little petty tyrant. And so an ideology is always a forced symbolism. And in order to float the forced symbolism, one has to have a mythological basis, because symbols do not take without a mythological energy. And so the first thing a demagogue does is get you to believe in the new mythology. Then it's very easy to get the new indoctrination. If you give a mythology to children before they're 5, between 6 months and 5 years of age, it takes a very concerted effort to change that. And usually the change verges upon breaking. So the choice is very difficult, because to later on correct something as serious as that, it often comes to a very delicate situation where you have to break the person. And this everything in them goes against. They will not do it. They cannot do it. And this is not for someone who is ill, or someone who is stupid, or someone who is exceptional in any way. An example. one of the most insightful, conscious people of the last 50, 60 years was Mircea Eliade. He was the chairman of the comparative religious program at the University of Chicago. He's one of the world's greatest writers. He wrote novels, he wrote investigations of mythology. We're going to use his Myth and Reality starting next week, paired up with Ernst Cassir's Language and Myth. Mircea Eliade, who in his autobiographies discloses, because he was a full person, he discloses his cultural ethos, his background in Romania, growing up and being smarter than anybody else, and wheedling his way to India on a kind of a scholarship to study with Surendranath Dasgupta, the greatest Indian philosopher of the 20th century, even greater than Radhakrishnan. Surendranath Dasgupta's 5-volume history of Indian philosophy is titanic. It orders 5,000 years of the complexity of Indian thought into a form which is permanent. And so here the young Eliade, 19 years old, studying with Dasgupta in Calcutta, but immature because the ethos out of which he came allowed him to play footsie with the daughter of Dasgupta, and you don't do this in a very high-class Indian family, especially a Bengali family. And so Dasgupta, in a very compassionate way, sent the young man up to Rishikesh, up to the Himalayas. You want to find out about the truth of God? All right. I'll send you directly to where you can get a crash course. I'll send you to the conscious yogis of Rishikesh. And of course, being professional, conscious teachers, the first thing they did is they broke him. They broke him into little tiny pieces. You think you've had mental breakdowns? You've seen nothing. They broke Eliade into conscious atoms. And they left him in his little hermitage for about a year. And finally, the swirling powers of nature brought enough back to where he stopped talking gibberish, and his wild-eyedness calmed down enough to where he began to understand that he had been functioning in a role, wearing a mask, and that mask was so complete for him that he thought that his European persona, his Romanian intellectual persona, was what was real about him, and it had nothing to do with what was real about him. And when he came back to himself, I went back to Romania. He no longer lived in Romania. He went to Paris, became French, because it was a different persona, and it allowed him enough space to be able to put himself together in a way which was more universal. And so he used the French language instead of the Romanian language, because the language already has a built-in mythological limitation. It's very difficult to be a Frenchman in speaking the Romanian language. It's very difficult to be a German speaking the French language. All ethnic languages have a built-in quality because of the mythological process of language. Language as myth, as its process, has a built-in arena of effectiveness. The very objective shape of the cognitive centers of the brain are to some great extent language-based. The Center for Japanese Language in the brain is distinctly further back and lower than the French Center for Language in the brain, and so on. The very structure of the objectivity of the brain, of that part of the body which is transformable. The neurological system is like a transformational grammar built into the body. So the neurological system transforms itself much more easily into the objectivity of the mind, whereas the cells of the hand pretty much like to stay hand. Thank goodness. The idea that comes in the maturation of language is so much more powerful than the image that it can index any number of images, just as the image is much more powerful than simply things, which is why Cicero's so-called art of memory was an imagination technique, loci et foci. The place is the tabletop. The focus are the objects on the tabletop. And if you rapidly put these objects here and rapidly take them away, one will develop the facility to get the gestalt, to see the image array instantly. One of the best presentations of this was in Rudyard Kipling's Kim. Kipling, who at age 36 became a real yogi, and when he was sitting in the United States in Vermont, he wrote one of the great yogic novels of all time, Kim. And because European peoples did not understand its depths, they considered it children's books. All really great things are considered children's books. It's too good to forget, but it's for them, not for us. But Kim is not a children's book at all. It's a Victorian Englishman who was brought up in India, so he was never English. He was Indian in ethos. He was a yogi ethnically. Though he spoke the English language and he looked English, he was at home in India. So he had this odd, surrealistic, this chimera, this combination of having an English language and an Indian ethos. It happened to a great number of people at that time. It's similar to American children of missionaries or German children of missionaries in China who grew up speaking English or German, but in China, and they had the same quality that Kipling had, vis-a-vis his Indian ethos and his English language. Richard Wilhelm, whose translation of the I Ching is one of the great glories of world literature, to put the I Ching into that kind of German, a good enough German that the Baines could take that German and make an English translation that had anything to do with the Chinese, that's unbelievable. But Wilhelm, well, like Kipling, grew up in a different ethos from the language which he used, and it emphasized the transformational grammar of the language rather than the natural referentiality of the language. If you grow up in Holstein and you speak the German language, Holstein cow that's a cow. That's what a cow is. But if you grow up in China where there are no Holstein cows, but there are bullocks, that's what you call a cow. And when you learn later that there are lots of different kinds of cows, it becomes very easy for you to jump from the thing to the image to the idea. And someone like a Wilhelm, someone like a Kipling, was able to rapidly mature through the image base, which is the transformational membrane between thing and idea. And so Wilhelm and Kipling and many individuals like that, who grow up in an ethos different from the language which they use at home, or the same thing or similar thing happens if you use several languages at home. If you grow up speaking English and Farsi and German in the home, if you grow up trilingual, it's very easy for you to quickly pass from the representation of things in words to the imagery of words to the powerful indexing idea that symbolically is capable of reshaping language. Once you master symbolic ideas, you can reshape language. You can then, in the words of Stanley Cavell, then you can say what you mean. Because meaning becomes the bones upon which language functions. You say to someone, like I'm speaking to you now, very highfalutin meaning, and I'm marshaling a language which for all intents and purposes is very strained to go from thing referent to imagery. So that everyone is kind of struggling to try and get the imagery, to try and follow what the language is. But the fact is that the language already has completely transformed beyond imagery into very powerful ideas of meaning. And once one gets with that kind of a flow, that indexing capacity of this kind of language reveals that it's not even limited by symbolic integration, but passes through a much deeper transformation. The transformation between myth and symbol is little bitty transformation compared to the oceanic gulf between symbol and vision. What's an image instance of that transformation? To be able to write E equals mc squared is a powerful, symbolic transformation of the language where one talks about energy, mass, speed of light. E equals mc squared is so far beyond the words energy, velocity, and light. But to be able to take E equals mc squared as symbolic amulet and use it transformationally as a talisman to make an atom bomb, the difference between Oppenheimer and Einstein is a vast gulf. It's unbelievable to be an Einstein. It is supernatural to be an Oppenheimer and take something off a page and turn it into an atom bomb. Yet at that moment when it first happened, what is the first thing that Oppenheimer says? He quotes the Bhagavad Gita about Shiva. He uses a mythological figure, Shiva, to express what has happened. Why? Because of the squares of attention law that we've been talking about the last month. Squares of attention have a foundational base, and they fulfill themselves with 4 phases at any one time. And if you have enough power to have a vision context, then the basis of your action is no longer nature but ritual. And if you have enough differential capacity to be a person, as Oppenheimer most certainly was, a person who's able to use vision in the way they want, then the foundation shifts even higher and moves from ritual to myth. And so when some person's using vision, mythic imagery is still useful, still viable, because it is the basis of that square of attention. The foundation of your whole operative form is no longer nature and no longer ritual. You've transcended nature. You've transcended the body. Your new foundation is language, and language is capacities and functions. And one of the challenges of history is that history moves beyond art, moves beyond the person. History is transpersonal on a very powerful level, so that the basis of operation has to mature out of myth into symbol. And the whole basis of dealing with the square of attention of history is that you have to found yourself on very clear mind. You have to have your symbols in order. Otherwise, you face a situation that you are outclassed immediately by design. Totally helpless. And we've seen that regression always follows universal pattern. It always goes to the next level of objectivity. And if the person is unable to function objectively, then the regression goes back to the mind. And if the mind is not functional, if its symbolic ordering is not up to the task, the regression goes all the way back to ritual. And that's when you get men and women marching shoulder to shoulder to somebody else's drumbeat by the tens of millions. It's not just a failure of persons, it's a failure of ideas, which is a failure of the symbolic function. If you have a failure of the ritual function, then you have death. So it becomes one of the cornerstones of an inculcated ideology to remind people that the alternative to marching for us is your death. And it's absolutely filled with veracity for people. And on that level, you have them cinched, hook, line, and sinker, and pond, and everything. Then one of the few alternatives left for a transformational grammar is someone tougher. The 20th century has suffered from this failure to address the energies of history, the differential problems of history on massive scale. Let's come back after the break, and we'll shift this a little bit to the way in which myth 8 now is not a loci et foci, but is a phase within the phase of myth itself. One of the great things about our education is it has an algorithmic structure built in so that you can refine it as much as you need to in order to get a coordination. And at the same time, you can enlarge it as much as you need to get whatever overview you need for operation. Let's take a break. And so we come to the second half of myth 8. And what we're considering is the loci et foci, the place and the focus. Though it's called the classic art of memory in Cicero, it's actually an imaginative, functional training. The imagination. And imagination, distinct from memory, both are complementarities of each other. For instance, visualization very often helps the quality of memory, whereas the audio very often helps the quality of imagination. Children who grew up with radio have very good imaginations. Children who grew up with TV have very good memories. But as one function comes into dominance, the other function recedes. So that one of the responsibilities of a really great education is to balance imagination and memory, to develop both functions together. And it turns out that you cannot develop one and then the other. You have to weave them together. You have to braid them together. And this, of course, takes comprehensive context. So an education that develops with a comprehensive contextuality is the only viable form. And what makes the form viable in terms of its gelling, of its holding together, is to have an algorithmic process of development also woven into this complementarity, which means that someone needs to be conscious on rather detailed scale. The classic confusion between memory and imagination in the way in which the Romans took, in the example of Cicero, the way in which the Romans took learning is founded upon Aristotle. And the place in Aristotle is in the Politics. And it's the Politics of Aristotle that has the misconception of language that leads to the erroneous assumption about man and his character. And this is how it reads in the Loeb Classical Library translation. Notice that it's in the treatise by Aristotle called Politics. This is to say, political forms are time-bound, and their particular form in which they have come down to us begins with Aristotle. And they had a lifespan that lasted until about 200 years ago. Political forms were out of date by the arrival of Newton and Leibniz and Benjamin Franklin and people like that, the Enlightenment. Here's how, in translation, Aristotle writes, "And why is man a political animal?" Why is man a political animal? Notice the phrase, notice the chimera built in. Political animal. And why man as a political animal is in a greater measure than any bee or any other gregarious animal is clear, for nature, as we declare, does nothing without purpose, and man alone of the animals possesses speech. Now notice the linking of language, especially spoken language, speech, to man, making him then a political animal. Is a classic case of mental confusion. You think, because of reputation, that Aristotle is a clear thinker. The rigors of modern mathematical logic show this is not the case. Aristotle is very primitive and leads to a lot of errors that are dead ends. The mere voice, it is true, can indicate pain and pleasure. Notice the Freudian bifurcation. The mere voice, it is true, can indicate pain and pleasure, and therefore is possessed by the other animals as well, for their nature has been developed so far as to have sensations of what is painful and pleasant, and to signify those sensations to one another, representation. So that pleasure and pain as indexing principles are tied to an ethos of limitation based upon functioning of language in its representational phase, and at most its image capacity phase. That means to say that this is a regressive ideation whose ceiling of functioning is on what one can imagine. But speech is designed to indicate the advantageous and the harmful, and therefore also the right and the wrong, pain, pleasure, advantage, harm, right, wrong, and the other moral qualities, and it is partnership in these things that makes a household and a city-state. The partnership of people all in the same boat, of having to use language to distinguish right and wrong, advantage and harm, pleasure and pain, is the basis then of the household and the city-state. Now comes a kicker, as they used to say. Thus, that means logically following from this, thus the city-state is prior in nature to the household and to each of us individually. When you wonder why powerful ideologies hold the state above the individual, you got it right here. It's the little green book that people wave and don't even understand that their hand with the clenched fist has a book in it that has ethnic limitations. And one of the most fundamental replies to this is the reply that Thomas Jefferson gave. The world belongs to the living, not to the dead, and especially not to worn-out ideas. Thus, the city-state, writes Aristotle, is prior in nature to the household and to each of us individually, for the whole must necessarily be prior to the part, since when the whole body is destroyed, foot or hand will not exist except in an equivocal sense, like the sense in which one speaks of a hand sculptured in stone as a hand. Notice that you can take the word referent out of thing and put it into image so that the word hand can function. Aristotle's logic functions to an imaginative ceiling and not very much beyond that. There's not much mythology in Aristotle. Whereas when you look at Plato, his teacher, mythology forms a very integral function in Plato, and Plato's educational program much superior to Aristotle. Aristotle founds his square of attention on nature as he understood it, as he saw it, as nature as a collection of things to be classified. Aristotle is the first categorizer of the things of nature, which is a ritual regression. It's an inculcation of ritual categorical activities back onto nature. The process is one that in the 60s we used to call the cookie cutter. Somebody gets a fantastic idea and then they stamp that idea on nature, and what is cut out, they say, oh, this is really great. Nature really follows this. This must be a titanic idea. And of course, all of this is just game playing, with masks no less. If you need to learn from some experts of how to deal with this world, Rilke and Yeats will do. They're great teachers of how to disconnect from the mask-like ritual comportments that cookie cutter nature into little biscuits, which then you can munch at your convenience in your parlor. Mother Nature doesn't have very much tolerance for that kind of being. She favors extinction. By the way, within 22 years of today, 25% of the species of life will be extinct by genetic estimation. So that nature is already flicking us off the table rather fast. That's one generation. For the whole must necessarily be prior to the part. And so you get out of this a kind of false holism, a false sense of holistic. As long as one is wearing the whole mask, one is then healthy. That's the psychology that comes out of this. So you're taught that role-playing is okay if you completely fill the role. There are many other things in here, but what is necessary for us to see is that the whole idea of the relationship of nature to the individual is mediated by the state as an archetypal form, as a symbolic idea that was one of the largest and most comprehensive at that time. Why was it? Because the state at that time meant the city-state. In Aristotle's time, the state meant the city-state. There were no nation-states. The state was the polis, and the polis was the alternative development to the ethos. The ethos is the tribal culture And the city-state is the development superior to the tribal culture. The tribal culture is mythic, whereas the city-state is not a culture, but a civilization based on the city, civis, civitates, the city. Civilization is made on cities, so the city-state. So the rise of classical Greek civilization. Aristotle is a progenitor of civilization, as opposed to the culture. Civilization is an indexing order higher than a culture. And it's true that this is the situation. But to have a real civilization, one cannot mature a single ethos into a civilization. A single ethos, a single culture, no matter how extensive it seems to those who are within it, is but a single vector in the development of the universe. Few cultures are as variegated and as long historical as the Jewish. Jewish culture is recognizable at any time in the last 4,000 years. It's a single vector. In fact, one asks a very serious question from time to time: are you of the Jewish faith? Do you live in that particular vector? Or if you're Chinese, the Chinese vector is extremely wide and extremely complex. Nevertheless, within the last 5,000 years, one can identify very easily if you're Chinese or not, especially in the last 2,000 years. A single culture, a single mythology does not develop into a civilization. A civilization is always at least two major vectors or more. So that the development, say, of this particular quality of life in what was the United States of Franklin and Jefferson is radical experiment in the unknown, compromised initially by having an English culture out of which it was spawning itself. Part of the limitations faced elsewhere in North America of that is the difference between someone, say, 130 years ago, who saw in Canada the Canadian Federation from a standpoint of Toronto, or, on the other hand, from a standpoint in Montreal. In Toronto, a single language. In Montreal, two languages minimal. And a whole different viewpoint. In the United States of Franklin and Jefferson, the attempt was to try to get out of an English language culture base, and so they used what was available at the time. They used French as an alternate language very frequently. Jefferson was as at home in French as he was in English. They were also, incidentally, at home in Latin and somewhat in Greek. But if one looks at the way in which Jefferson's mind functioned consciously, he has an equal focus of French and English language mentality, very similar to the kind of figure that you would have found in Montreal of 130 years ago. At home, ambidextrously in two different cultures, and able then to have not just a synthesis between the two, but a differential tensor, developing possibilities beyond the two. So that Jeffersonian America is a completely different phenomena from the Constitution. The Constitution, the constitutional basis of America, has had its manifestation as the administration of George Washington. And George Washington's America is constitutional. It's federal quality, verging, incidentally, towards a reinstatement of the monarchy. In fact, one of the great intellectuals of that time, Alexander Hamilton, favored coming back into a monarchy and using the federal party as a parliament, which would allow for Washington or his successors to be monarchs again, to be kings again, because it's a very good form of government. The Revolution of 1800, which brought in a Jeffersonian republicanism, completely overshadowed the development of that kind of federal monarchical tendency. Because the basis of Jefferson's vision does not found itself on Aristotle, but founds itself on the lessons of Rousseau. And Rousseau has completely different outlook of man vis-a-vis man in nature put into a proportion of man and society. Man as the bridge between nature and society in Rousseau is quite a different bridge from Aristotle. Aristotle's bridge has little bitty spaces in between the piers, making sure that you're well grounded in the good old mud all the time. Whereas Rousseau is an enlightened French engineer who likes these broad arches, great big sweeps. Because the French sense of civilization coming out of the Enlightenment is a complete reassessment and recutting of the kind of Aristotelian basis that was there previous. A Frenchman like Montesquieu, who wrote The Spirit of Laws, takes to task the kind of Aristotelian Greek, Roman-developed legal system of society and state and individual, and talks about the cursive sweep of the spirit, the wonderful pirouettes of the ballet of intelligence working with nature, and that one can have forms that were never even dreamed of. So instead of having on an Aristotelian bedrock a Roman aqueduct type of a system of bridging between man, bridging nature and society, one has these wonderful sweeping arches. And Rousseau, in the Social Contract, writes, Book 2, Chapter 1, sovereignty is inalienable. Inalienable. It's a word that we remember Jefferson writing in the Declaration of Independence. Man has not rights from the state. His individuality is not because the state has given him rights, but they're inalienable in the sense that he is never an alien in nature. His rights come from nature and not from the state. That his political form is not cultural based in the mythological flow, but comes from the primordiality of the natural flow. Rousseau recounts the first moment that he realized the mask that he had worn all of his life. He was on Lake Geneva in a rowboat and trying personally to deal with his own effervescent temperament, which is a euphemism. He had rowed himself out onto Lake Geneva to sit out and to cuss and curse in silence. When the fog and mist blotted out the landscape momentarily and he just rode on the gentle waves of Lake Geneva, he forgot for a long moment about being Rousseau and just was there on the lake, and all of a sudden something happened to him. And he realized that outside of Rousseau was a consciousness that was at one with the landscape. And not only just floated on the lake, but flowed with the lake. And when the mist lifted, he was a part of the landscape. And he rubbed his mental eyes and asked a very good question. Who is Rousseau? Because if I am not Rousseau, then we better speak to the playwright. It was later on developed by Don Miguel de Unamuno in his famous way. He wrote a novel, and when he finished the novel, he had an appendix where the characters came to his study and demanded more story. That since he had created them, they had a reality equal to people, and therefore he had a moral obligation to write more stories for them. How dare he create them and then kill them off by not, de facto, by not writing more stories? It's the Cervantine problem of Don Quixote. That sovereignty is inalienable. Rousseau writes, distinct from Aristotle, the first and foremost deduction from the principles we have so far laid down is that the general will alone can direct the state according to the object for which it was instituted. In other words, for if the clashing of particular interests made the establishment of societies necessary, because there's so many of us and we're all different, and our clashes make some kind of overall situation necessary, the agreement of these very interests, we all need to live, we all need to find some resolution, make it possible. The common element in these different interests is what forms the social tie. Later on he will say the formalization of this tie is in a contract, the social contract. That the Constitution is but a temporary phase of a contract means that it's not written in universal stone. In fact, Jefferson, in a good Rousseau fashion, said every 19 years, every generation, that new generation should have the right to review every form that they're using and just let go of those that are no longer useful and institute new ones. And that the only way that that happens is that the common people be educated. And so here on the very front of our education pamphlet, what does it read? Above all things, I hope education of the common people will be attended to, convinced that on their good sense we may rely with the most security for the preservation of a due degree of liberty. Jefferson to Madison, just before Christmas 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was happening, and Jefferson was not there. So Madison was there for him. The young Madison was there. Why? Where was Jefferson? Jefferson was in Paris. And it was about this time that Jefferson was having to his supper table those people who made the French Revolution, who, when they came into power, they scrapped the calendar of the church and of the French nation and started with the year 1, a new time form, because everything had ended, and they were quite accurate to do so. In this, Jefferson's very Rousseauian. Bear with us just for a second. The common element in these different interests is what forms a social tie, and were there no point of agreement between them at all, no society could exist. It is solely on the basis of the common interest that every society should be governed. I hold then that sovereignty, being nothing less than the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and that the sovereign, who is no less than a collective being, cannot be represented except by himself. No one can wear the mask of the king, for the king is a sovereign collective being, and kingship is a great idea. That's why it indexes. That's why it has the power. The power indeed may be transmitted, but not the will. So that one has very deep sense here in Rousseau. Because in between Aristotle and Rousseau is something called 2,000 years of history. And that block of 2,000 years of history is dominated by a Roman form of the state. And a little short course here. The Roman form of the state is made by one man, Augustus Caesar. And he always went by the two names, Augustus Caesar, because there were two different lines of power. One was the power of the Caesars, and the other was the line of power of Augustus. And even in later Roman history, there were people who held the Caesar kind of power, and there were other people who held the Augustus kind of power, and they tried to merge them together. The Caesar power is the family line of power. It's the cultural lineage of power, whereas the Augustus power is the civilized overview. It's the idea. Augustan power is ruling by the powerful controlling ideas. Caesar power is ruling because one's family has always been in control, and aristocratically one is ennobled and able to carry this out. The Caesar lineage of Augustus Caesar was channeled through his uncle, Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is the first Roman to be deified as a god, divine Julius. The mythological buck starts there. Julius Caesar was the only one who could wear the red boots and the purple cape, which were the insignia of the man become God. The inculcation upon Jesus of being a man who became God is a Julius Caesar projection. It has nothing to do with Jesus. It has everything to do with Roman power. It has everything to do with the way in which an Augustus Caesar brought two disparate lines of power together and wove them on the basis of a third kind of power. So one has three kinds of power. One has a power which comes from the general population of people. And out of the general population of people, the noble families are the best representatives to rule. And out of that, the most noble family, the one that would rise to the top because they have the most experience, the best genes, the best blood. So that the Caesar kind of power is a family line of power, and it comes from the cultural basis. Where the Augustan power is an ideational, a symbolic power. The Caesar power is a kind of power that's there on a ritual level. Aristocratic families, like the Caesars, like the Habsburgs, ruled because they had that kind of power from the people, which registers as assemblies of the people. But the Augustus power is an executive power. The power of the people is a legislative power. The power of the executive is an Augustan power. The Caesar power is a power of legislation of the people, which incidentally is transferable from people to terrain. You can transfer it from the kinds of people who are there to the land in which those people have always lived. France is the French people, but France is also French turf. So the assemblies can represent not only people, but they can represent turf. And because of that bifurcation, which either one works, the legislative quality has to be bicameral. The Senate represents the people. The House of Representatives represents the turf, the districts, the land. But the executive power, the Augustan power, is quite different from the Caesar power. And the archetype of the way that they're woven together was first woven by Augustus Caesar on the prototype of Julius Caesar. But the third kind of power is the power of the judicial, of the courts, of law, of the legal things, of lawyers. Lawyers are the priests of a religious power that's founded on the courts being like temples. Why does the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. look like a Greek temple? Because that's what they meant it to be. That's the image base. That's what it is. And why do lawyers pontificate? Because the original Pontifex Maximus was Julius Caesar. He's the first person who not only was satisfied of being the dictator, of having the Caesar power and the Augustan power temporarily brought together, but he also commandeered for himself, as Julius Caesar, he took upon himself the position of Pontifex Maximus, the leader of Roman religion. He was the first man to bring all three together. So he was deified not because he was a strong man with military and had the people, or was a strong man with ideas and had the vision of dictator for life. He was the first dictator for life. But he had a third vision, even more powerful, that he was the head of Roman religion, which was in charge of making ultimate decisions and judgments about what was right and wrong, about all these other pairs that occur here in Aristotle. Religio means binding together, the judgment of what holds and what doesn't hold. Does not depend upon the power of the Caesars, the power of assembly. It does not depend upon an executive power of Augustus. It's on that third power, which is the power of law, the legal religion, the judge. So that when a time form, which is held together by legislative and executive powers, comes to a close, those powers are suddenly eclipsed by the remaining context that held it together, which is the judicial power, the judgment power, the legal power. When you read an apocalypse, all apocalypses are all about judgment day. They're not about assembly day. They're not about executive day. They're about judgment day. If you go into the Sistine Chapel, sure, the ceiling, which is world famous, is all about the mythology underlying the power of the Roman Catholic Church. But the power is not in the ceiling. That's the mythological canopy. But the focus of the power is the back wall, which is the context of the altar. And on the back wall is Judgment Day. And while Michelangelo is a world-class artist in terms of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, He puts his own self-portrait in Judgment Day on the back wall of the Sistine Chapel. Because right in the center of it is God Almighty, separating those who are damned from those who are saved. And in his hand, God holds a pelt of a man with all the flesh and bones drained out, and it's just the pelt. It's the pelt of Michelangelo. You can tell from the face. Because Michelangelo understood. He's a very big genius. When he was 16 years old, he went up to the Via Carregi, the Fiesole Ridge above Florence, and sat in with Ficino and Pico and all the makers of the Renaissance. And so from a teenager, Michelangelo learned to think cosmically, and he understood. And he understood very well that he's a world-class artist in terms of the ceiling. He's just a pelt image in terms of the Judgment Day. Because on that kind of a level, Judgment Day is always an apocalyptic end of an integral energy cycle. And the person is a differential development out of that, beyond that. If you cut the integral base out from underneath an individual, all you're left with is a pelt. Because there's no basis for it. Unless one has truly and perfectly transcended, in which case one is just a spirit then. Or is a spirit. Or both. One is a spirit and a pelt. It's the integral cycle that has objectivity in the body and the mind that has to be there. It's the flesh and bones of the whole thing. The ritual bones and the symbolic flesh are what make physical reality here and keep it here and keep it viable. Beyond that, if one had the differential realm alone, one would have just spirits and pelts, and the pelts would probably evaporate. So that to the natural person, the differential consciousness, the whole supernatural realm, is an abstract evanescence that doesn't have any reality to it. They can't imagine any reality to it. And indeed, it's not imaginable. One cannot imagine memory. If you cannot function memnotically, you can't imagine it. From the standpoint of imagination, no matter how powerful it is, you cannot imagine memory functioning. You have to do it. And so there is a development that's very crucial here. It's crucial in the way in which culture becomes a civilization, in which myth deepens into symbols. And our education is now going to be concerned with that aspect of mythology. The next 4 weeks, the next month, the next 4 lectures, which is another square, is about symbolic mythology. Instead of the kind of mythology that we have been talking about, the mythology of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and of Ruth Benedict and the patterns of culture, we're going to shift to Mircea Eliade and Ernst Cassirer. Language and myth, myth and reality. Notice here, language and myth, myth and reality. That language is a membrane in between the way in which myth deepens from paying attention to language qualities to paying attention to reality qualities. So myth itself as a process is an interface between language and reality. In fact, there's a wonderful thinker who wrote a book on language and reality, a man named Wilbur Urban. Urban's several books on linguistic philosophy came out about 30 or 40 years ago. Extremely well done. When we look at Kasur and Eliade together, starting next week, we will start a new square of attention in myth. Each of the sections of our education, 12 weeks long, have 3 4-week sections. Each of those 4-week sections is a square of attention in itself. And one can simplistically reduce it down to beginning, middle, and end. So lectures 1 through 4 are the beginning, square of attention. Lectures 5 through 8 are the middle, and lectures 9 through 12 are the end. So in terms of the process of myth in our education, myth 8 today is the end of the middle. It's the 4th corner of the middle. And next week will be the 1st corner of the end. Each of these phases, beginning, middle, and the end, are shared throughout the development of all of the larger seasons of our course. 3 months of nature had 3 different squares of attention in nature. The 12 weeks of ritual can be seen structurally as 3 squares of attention in ritual. When we come to symbols next, the 12 weeks of symbols can be seen as symbols 1 through 4 is a square of attention. Symbols 5 through 8, a middle square of attention. Symbols 9 through 12, the end of that square of attention of symbol looking towards the development of differential consciousness and vision. Nature, ritual, myth, and symbol together are a very large square of attention, the largest square of attention possible. What was important for us in the idea of squares of attention is that in that kind of a geometry of stability, we cannot effectively go beyond that juxtaposition of a pair of pairs. We do function beyond it, but we don't function beyond it in terms of what we can attend to. And as new qualities come into play and join what we're attending to, those previous qualities subside into the background. It's like form and background. The hand that I hold up as a form is a form because it's distinct from the background. And the more that the background is nothing in itself, the more that the form is clear. So as energy is fed into attention and one's awareness becomes honed more and more, form increasingly is clear, but increasingly the background recedes even more into a subconscious quality. So that one has the possibility. Early in the 20th century, a mathematician named Edmund Husserl developed a philosophy called phenomenology, which he said is possible to perceive powerfully enough, symbolically, as to bracket things. And he used a Greek term, he called it an eidetic reduction. To see things just as they are and only as they are, not more, not less. And when one hones perception to that extent, phenomena are exactly what they are. But in the law of complementarities, when things are exactly what they are, non-things are exactly what they aren't. And the context, instead of being semi-there so that you could be aware of it, is exactly not there. And so one needs to be extremely sharp and conscious, because as one becomes sophisticated in seeing phenomena, one has to attend to the fact that you're not seeing the noumena. Precisely and exactly not seeing it. one of the best poets of the 20th century, Wallace Stevens, wrote a poem called The Snowman. I'll bring it next week, and we'll start off Myth 9 with a poetic key for us. Deep in Wallace Stevens' poem, it's short, it's only about 12 lines, 15 lines, is the eidetic reduction of a winter scene and the sudden, complete obverse of it, of the whiting out of the winter scene and the awareness of the wind, which was not apparent in the winter scene visually, but as soon as he shifted to audio, he heard the wind, but then didn't see the scene. Stevens wrote the poem about the time when the United States was going through a fantastic shift in capacity by the introduction of radio. Wallace Stevens was the vice president of Hartford Insurance Company. He was the chief operative executive. And he wrote his poems on the way to the office. And when he got there, the executive secretary at Hartford Insurance took down the poem of the day. And one of the earliest poems is The Snowman, of Stevens honing his imagination so much that he was aware of what he was imagining, either audially or visually exclusive of each other. And when one has this imaginative capacity, when you can see but not hear, and then suddenly, a moment later, hear but not see, and alternate that, and be conscious of that kind of checkered tapestry, one has a supernatural Rousseauian quality of asking, what's going on here? And when you look at nature and you look at the state from that kind of a standpoint, their whole rationale dissolves completely. Not only is nature not what you thought nature was, but the state is not what you thought the state was at all. What's in its place? An alternating, ambidextrous flow which has no preference whatsoever. When was this first noticed? This was first noticed about 2,300 years ago in Alexandria, in Greco-Roman Egypt. It's the first time that human beings came to this kind of a crisis. For as Aristotle was a pupil of Plato and misunderstood Plato and took it in an odd direction, Aristotle's prize student Alexander the Great also misunderstood his teacher and took it in a wild new direction. And Alexander the Great's direction was consummated by Augustus Caesar. Just before he became Augustus Caesar, a day before he became Augustus Caesar, Augustus spent a night alone in the great tomb of Alexander, at the center of Alexandria. He wouldn't let anybody else in order to make sure that he had got what he experienced. He had the glass crown of the sepulcher raised, and he reached in and he touched the point of the nose of Alexander and broke it off. And Augustus, in his own way, used that finger tip, which had broken the nose of Alexander the Great, to issue his edicts. And his edicts were in the form of a new kind of power. He said, the people have the power which is equal to the executive power, with one proviso, that you ask me first. I am the first citizen. And so you can say anything you want to, but you must hear me first. And of course, giving the ritual cowardice of human beings, when someone that powerful speaks first, it's the origin of the phrase, the yes men. I know the tape has run out, but they don't need to know this. That whole train of endeavor was engraved with such a deep mythological stylus that civilization has stayed stuck in its rut except for a few times when it's jumped its track. And when it jumps its track, the first thing that happens is you hear a rzzz. And if you're trying to slavishly follow and you think your intelligence is tied up with the record playing, you think that nothing's happening. The kind of example that Rousseau had was that he realized that when the stylus is not on the record, a lot is happening. And Wallace Stevens takes it to an even deeper level, that so much is happening, it trivializes what was on the record. Rousseau put the stylus back on the record and then tried to record for himself. Wallace Stevens broke the record. We don't need to be caged any longer by the kinds of limitations that are rote replications of something that happened several thousand years ago. Part of what this education is all about is getting the continuity of letting you color outside the lines, letting you hear outside the records. And so if you find me being like some kind of interstellar Holden Caulfield, being juvenile delinquent on star system level, it's because I'm inviting you to play. There's huge world outside the sandbox that we were given to grow up in. And though it doesn't seem like there should be, there's so much life outside of the lives that we were given that it seems almost trivial. Not that our lives are trivial. They're very important. But those aspects of ourselves that are capable of being outside of our lives should at least be looked at. And on that scale, we are free on a level of eternity. More next week.